a.m. on Friday, August 30th. This is the Beach Preservation Ad Hoc Committee meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public have been duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. A couple of items on our agenda today. First is an update on discussion with Wild Dunes Community Association leadership regarding beach renourishment funding and public access. Just real quick, I sent an email, but just to get it into public record, Desiree, Douglas, and I met with Dave Kanowski, who is COO of the Community Association, and Jim Anderson, who is president of the Wild Dunes Community Association. So again, we're talking about the Community Association, not the resort on this conversation. And hit a number of items with them, one being the Army Corps study that we've sent the letter into the Army Corps to get in their protocol in some future fiscal year to do the study. And Wild Dunes understands that that request at this point is just for the south end of the island. That's the specific request into the Army Corps at this point, and knowing that it is a ways off before next steps happen on that. The shoal management project.
Philip, before we get off that topic, can we delve into that topic a little bit more? I think the last time that we've been talking about qualification for the Wild Dunes, or I guess the east end of the island, to be qualified for the Army Corps. If we, and you know, I'm kind of looking at this, the decision to either pursue that or not for the entire island is going to impact the entire island, because if we're only receiving funding for one end of the island but not the other end of the island, and something happens at the other end of the island, then we're going to have to fund that somehow. And from what I think we've talked about, you know, Army Corps, if we pursue that for the entire island, that doesn't preclude us from doing our own thing, I think, and jump in if I'm getting any of this wrong. The second aspect of it was we've got our application in, and it's what I think they said from application to sand on the beach could be anywhere from 5 to 7 years. If we don't include the east end of the island or Wild Dunes in our request, for every day that we don't have it in a request, do we have to resubmit the application, or is it something we can modify down the road? I don't know the answer to that question. What I was hoping for to potentially qualify Wild Dunes for this type of public funding is somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 35 spots, which was at least a pleasant surprise for me. And it has no impact to gate access. It could be paid parking. It could be reserved parking. All of those criteria are something that, you know, may be palatable to residents, at least to consider. Because without that funding, I think it goes through an assessment on the residents within there. But again, looping back, without that decision and without that pursuit of going after that money, I think it has an island-wide impact, because if we don't, we're going to have to make it up somewhere. So I was kind of hoping that, you know, Wild Dunes would, you know, not looking for commitments, and I think they have some validation to do whether what their plan is would be qualified, but when we go through our financial modeling and trying to find out where we're going to find money, this is a big assumption. You know, if we could get $30 million of funding for the east end over the 30-year period, you know, that's a lot of money, and that's, you know, that's basically like $1 million a parking spot, and money that wouldn't have to fall on the backs of the residents and the resort. Or conversely, and it's Wild Dunes residents and resorts' decision, if they decide that we don't want to pursue this, then we're going to have to figure out where we're going to find the money. So that's kind of where I'd like to see where, if they're willing to say, hey, you know what, we're willing to pursue this, and then maybe include it in the application now, or not.
Yeah, and I think the potential, the likelihood, I mean, all the words you just used in there are what's giving Wild Dunes some pause, and Desiree and Douglas or Stephen, I know y'all have had conversations. I mean, there's not, I think Wild Dunes would rather go get some commitment from the state that says if we add 30, 40, 50 spots, pick a number, that there is a high likelihood that we will be eligible for funding. Because that is a pipe dream at this point, without a doubt.
What's the pipe dream? I'm just wondering.
There's no funding.
Today there isn't, but we're looking at 30 year. I mean, 30 years is a long horizon.
That.
Yeah.
But
Well,
there's no funding?
From the federal standpoint, it's a
Could
different
be.
story,
Could be.
right?
Right,
But you'd have to have the parking first.
right.
Can I ask, what's the?
Let me just finish the comment. So there's a desire on their part to get some commitment before they go talk to HOA, the regimes, is where the parking would probably most likely take place, because that's really all you have at all the different condo buildings. So I think I know there's a desire to go get some commitment on behalf of the state, which could lead to the federal funding as well, before they approach the regimes to give up some parking.
So when you say they, are you referring to to Dave and Jim, or?
Yeah, Wild Dunes
Okay.
Community Association.
Okay. So, but again, I think this is an island-wide impacting decision.
I don't disagree with that, but their comment is before they go have conversations to give up parking, I think they would like some level of
That's
commitment
fair, yeah.
Yeah,
that
I
there's
think
going to be
That's
funding
fair.
attached to it.
it's a little bit of what comes first, the
Yeah.
chicken or the egg. Is do they pursue securing some public access or public parking within the resort or within the community association, with the hopes that once it's established, when funding becomes available at the state level, then they would become eligible? Or if they do that and no funding becomes available, that they've provided public parking and not getting any public benefit from it from a funding perspective for beach nourishment. So I think that's why the mayor was saying, what we heard was, let's us understand and get a commitment from the state about what the requirement would be. If there is funding available, what do we have to do, and confirm our interpretation of the public access requirements to be 30, 35 parking spaces, or will they be looking at something else? I mean, the language of the law, it's a little broad. So there's just a desire to get clarity from the state, who then determines through a local comprehensive beach management plan whether or not you qualify and meet the public access definition. Doing that first before pursuing, I think, presenting a proposal to their residents, if that makes sense.
So a simpler question is, can we amend our application to regarding the federal funding at this point, that if just as a placeholder, so when we get to the point where we have a decision to make, perhaps we'll be in a better position, but we won't have put it on a back burner. We won't have separated the island. It will be one island, and then can we amend backwards? I'm just concerned. I think that might be what Scott was getting at, is if we don't amend it now for a broader, it'd be easier to make it more narrow if that becomes the case than it would be to go narrow and try to broaden it.
Or the opposite may be
That's
true.
all.
I think your
Is that-
point is, the earliest, the timeline that we've had, the earliest that we can get funding allocated for the feasibility study is FY '27. I guess when we get to that point, if then Wild Dunes decides and has a plan implemented that does qualify them for public access, would we have to start the process all over again while amending that requirement? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah,
My recollection when they came to speak to us was that they were going to have to study the entire area, decide what areas qualify and what areas didn't qualify. So I don't see the downside if we submit the entire island.
I think they've done
Then
that.
make the
They've
decision.
done that.
They've done that.
I'm sorry?
They've done that.
So the only area that qualifies is the area that it has public access
Well, but
today.
if we submit the Wild Dunes side and we say supposing it has public access at the time,
Right.
then I don't see where the downside is. And
Let
when
them tell us
because
no.
Things, with the government, we don't know, it may very well be they say, well, you should have done that 3 years ago, and we didn't consider it. So if we put it in there and we decide to withdraw, we can, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. And I don't see any downside to it.
Stephen, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say from the can't speak on behalf of the Corps, obviously, but when they are determining whether a beach is eligible or not, they do an economic analysis of the infrastructure that could be damaged by a storm. They do erosion analysis to look at various beach conditions and dune configurations and things like that. So if they only did that for one particular area, and then you wanted to add another one later on, it probably would take them at least a year, if not more, to reevaluate the project, redo that cost-benefit analysis, and it's just a long, slow process.
and is
with
it
them.
another $3 million of application
And
fee?
it certainly would be a significantly more money. Whether they can do that on the front end, I don't see why they couldn't. unless their policy just said they couldn't if it's not clearly accessed now. That part I
Yeah,
really can't speak to.
That would be the question, would they do it under the hypothetical that, what if public access that, is met 3 years from now, what would that look like?
Yeah, when's that snapshot in time when they
Yeah.
say, today's the study, this is the start point, what exists today?
Does it
And
make
that's what
sense for
we're
someone to reach out to them to find out the answer to that before we make a decision either
Yeah,
way?
we can do that.
And I think it would just end up reading something in effect of those areas eligible will be evaluated via feasibility. And that just leaves it wide open between, and it doesn't step on anyone's toes.
And but we're applying logic to the Army Corps.
I know, that's why it's good to make the
Yeah,
communicate.
that's an easy enough question.
And I guess as a follow-up, is there, we weren't at the meeting, I guess it was a week ago, last Thursday. Is there a commitment from the Wild Dunes representatives to pursue that state, I guess pre-qualification? And is there a timeline for that, or is that part of the outcome of the meeting?
I mean, I think their commitment was to go have state-level conversations to see if they could get some type of
What would
commitment.
qualify?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say from, I mean, I'm not them, but I don't necessarily think it would be the worst thing in the world for them to go through the process, come up with parking, and if the state or the federal says no, then shut it down. I mean, that's.
And then we've got our assumption nailed down,
Yeah,
whether we have
I
the
mean, it
funding
doesn't-
opportunity or
They
not.
can get rid of, parking anytime they want.
agree.
They're a little different than we are.
I do think that, maybe this was just a personal assumption, but, your comment that if they don't fund it, that the residents would. I think from my perspective, I assume that that was kind of their decision, and if they didn't fund it, they would need to bear that decision and the repercussions of that. Not that then it would come to the city and the city would kind of.
And I would concur. I think we just need to codify that is the assumption, because I don't want to assume anything. Because I
Right.
think there's still debate right now going on, or new debate, because the funding has dried up, of, how I think the beach fund's been contributing like 25% to the projects. And now there's a discussion of, well, should it be 50 or more because of the A tax being generated? These are all really big assumptions that are going to impact how much money we really need to raise and how we're what's the policy for
So
deployment.
maybe we need to kind of nail that down.
And
And
document.
that-
Well,
and
that
document it.
was another of their takeaways, was if the city's model assumes a 25% funding from the Wild Dunes Community Association, just like our beach renourishment fund, theirs will not support that. So if we go to 50, that the city pays, I mean, that obviously affects our model pretty heavily. So they have some their takeaway was two things: go back and do some additional analysis on their beach renourishment funding projections for future years, and go have the state level conversations to get some type of commitment. Sorry, Katie.
So that all brings into one of the questions I have had recently, which is, we just voted this week to spend $300,000 roughly on sandbags and Wild Dunes. But the city's paying 100% of that. Why is there not the sharing of with Wild Dunes when it comes to things like that? And do we have any sort of, what is our policy? It seems like it's just
We'd
kind
like to nail that down.
Yeah,
I think that's the point of
B.
today's meeting.
Yeah.
so I mean, but
It's
But
Yeah, that's a-
specifically, we didn't have that question on today's. I mean, there's just kind of a host of, we are trying to figure things out a little bit on the fly. So there's a host of questions. We're kind of,
I mean, is it
starting
because
with
it's an
high level.
emergency that the city's been
Yes.
doing it over time, but there's never
Right.
been, I mean, did we ask them to pay their share of that, or?
No, I mean, so last year, when the city, the first problem area was Breach Inlet, and city council approved about $1.25 million for emergency scraping, trucking in, and sandbags, and an additional 200 for sandbags. At the same time, Beechwood East started having issues, and city council had the discussion, and, there was some thought about, well, the city's helping, fully funding emergency work on one end, and, I think an expectation of doing the same on the other side. But I think maybe a good segue into the next conversation, the city has never funded emergency work, with the exception of immediately after a storm, when it's been funded by FEMA. on a 75-25 share by doing emergency berm restoration after the Joaquin and Irma in 2016 and 2017. There have been areas within Wild Dunes that have experienced emergency situations other than Irma and Joaquin in 2016 and 2017 at Breach Inlet. The property owners within Wild Dunes were responsible for any emergency restoration work. There have been sandbags placed in the past. There was an experimental project to install
I remember that
wave dissipation devices.
PVC thing.
Yes, so all of that has been funded by private property owners. And I think that the shift in policy came last year when council was faced with this discussion and, you know, felt like because we had a beach preservation fee fund, that the city should be in the front seat of emergency restoration work. But I think that raises a lot of questions for this committee to evaluate, you know, moving forward. Should that continue to be the policy? Should there be a cost share, recognizing that there is a private and a public component to this action? So that has, and you know, to be quite honest, when the situations down at Breach Inlet started happening and we had a handful of properties that were getting close to the emergency condition, our direction to those property owners were, you can get an emergency order, here are your options, you
Kind
can
of
do
past
scraping.
practice.
Very much past practice, and I think that there was a shift at the policy level, that the city should be the one seeking the permit, should be the one organizing it, paying for it, because we had funding available.
Well, I want to say something on that. You know, at first I applaud the city for taking the endeavors to make the repairs and to put up the sandbags, and part of it's because we're in a very interesting position. You've got the city that the residents don't pay. The residents aren't paying for the sandbags. They're not paying for the work to be done. That's generally generated from the 1% fund, which is generated from funds off island. So the idea that the residents are paying for it just is not really correct, and I think people need to understand that. I don't think they do. They think it's coming out of their pockets. You know, a distinction would be the drainage project, the $50 million drainage project, where the city pays for all of that, but a lot of the residents don't have drainage problems. So you've got to decide, I think, and it's the chicken or egg you mentioned, but you know what, is it one island where it's one island, we take care of all of it, or is it going to be districts where we have to divide it and you surcharge depending on what you need at your particular area? You know, I look at the issue of the city paying for it, and I also think about how that intertwines with the reality that everybody is paying taxes on the island. Everybody is impacted by the beach. And if we don't protect the beach, it impacts everybody. But I don't, and then you also add to it that we have a beach preservation fund, which generates a significant amount of money. And there's $8-9 million in the account. Wild Dunes has money they're ready to contribute. And the city makes a decision on when it is that they're going to spend that money, and how they're going to spend it and what they're going to spend it on. And the way I look at it, my personal view is, you've got to decide, do you want to do a beach renourishment, or do you want to accept the responsibility of using those funds to create a Band-Aid to protect you until you can do the next beach renourishment? And it's got to be an evaluation of time. And the longer you wait to do a beach renourishment, the more Band-Aids you got to put up. The sooner you do it, the less problems you have, but you got to come up with those funds. And I know that we're trying, that there's certainly there's certainly people that are a thought process that we'd like to extend it as long as we can, whether it's 8 or 10 years. You know, I question the reality of that, and it seems to me more like 6 to 8 years is probably a better number, a safer number. But to get past that 6 to 8 years, then you got to do the Band-Aids. So there's no perfect answer to it, but I don't know how we can have citizens paying towards a beach renourishment fund and saying to the island, please do the renourishment, I've got problems, and you know it's coming because the last one was in 16, 8 years ago, and as history goes further, it gets more and more frequent without paying attention to those factors. So, and I know that's going to all intertwine with the discussions we're having, including legal liabilities and what you must do, but a lot of times the legal liabilities are created by, if you undertake to do something, you have to do it. And I think that undertaking to create a tax to do beach renourishment creates a responsibility to either do the renourishment or alternatively to to do the Band-Aids. And I think the Band-Aids at this point are a lot less expensive from a mechanical standpoint of studying it versus doing an earlier renourishment and spending all of that money.
Band-Aids are less expensive over the long haul.
I think so, depending on how many Band-Aids you need to do. If you want to wait 10 years, the Band-Aids are more expensive.
Oh, you're
Perhaps.
saying Band-Aids with an 8-year cadence are less expensive than if you do a 10-year cadence?
I would say Band-Aids with a 6-year is certainly less expensive. When you get to 8, I don't know what the studies are going to show. But I think you take on the responsibility of having to make that decision. And, you know, to me, it seems like the first place to start, and I know we've discussed this in some of the meetings, is how often should you do the renourishment? And, you know, we can't just guess, and we can't say it's 8 to 10 years because I don't have data to support that. I think we're just making a guess that let's try to make it 8 to 10 years. But if it's not 8 to 10 years, then you own the responsibility to fix it along the way. And at the end of the day, that responsibility impacts everybody on the island. We're spending off money on it that we've generated, but more importantly, we're protecting the beach. And right now, the beach is not in good shape. And that's going to have an impact on everybody's value. It's going to impact the visitors coming to the island. It's going to impact the residents' access to the beach. So I think that's a very complicated place that we're in, and we've got to make a decision as to how to proceed. But I don't think it's as easy as to say property owners historically have paid for it, we should have them pay for it, and they're on their own, when meanwhile the city hasn't contributed city funds to do any of it.
I mean, that's not true. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
the city has
all.
pursued permits and paid for the two, a part of the two large renourishment projects that we've done on the island that where we've needed. It just so happens that it wasn't until the last 2 years that we've had another area of the beach experiencing erosion. But the areas that have historically experienced erosion, the city has been the permittee, has paid for the permitting, for the engineering, for the management, and for a big portion of the cost of the actual project.
Is that not coming out of the beach renourishment fund?
That is coming from the
And-
beach
and
renourishment
The beach
fund.
renourishment fund is generated from off-island money coming to the island, not the residents.
The-
In other words, the residents that live here are not being taxed and paying money that is being used for the renourishment.
That is
renourishment
correct.
money's coming from off-island,
It's generated by the people that stay on the island.
correct? As
Heads and
opposed to
beds.
the drainage project, which is being paid for by the citizens that live on the island.
Correct.
So how do you allow certain people to benefit and not all people to benefit? And that goes back to the same thing we've discussed repeatedly, which is it one island? We all live together, we all take care of the problems on the island. Or is it gonna be separate parts of the island? We're gonna divide up. If we're gonna go down that road, we're gonna need a whole lot more meetings than once every couple of months.
I guess I'm not understanding the point you're trying to make about the fact that drainage is paid for by GO bonds, which ultimately come from a combination of funding, including tourism funds, just to be
Yeah.
clear. It's a combination of general fund money, and it's a combination of tourism dollars as well, which include hospitality taxes and include other accommodation taxes, both municipal and state accommodation taxes. So drainage is paid by a combination of residents and tourism. The Beach Preservation Fee Fund is only generated by those people that stay on the island, heads in beds, so resorts, short-term rentals.
The
Not
point
to
I was
mention
making-
if the people from Wild Dunes want to be able to reach the connector, the drainage has to be dealt with because
Exactly.
drainage has to do with, drainage mostly,
It's roads.
it's unfortunate when it's in your yard, but it is mostly to do with roads and transportation.
By no means,
So when Palm floods, it doesn't just affect the person that lives in front of that flooding.
It affects emergency
everybody.
services.
And then when you get to the 41st and we have to shut down the fire department, which services Wild Dunes, that's obviously a big deal too. I mean, so flooding is,
Flooding mitigation affects everyone,
Everybody.
everyone, every day, and it's paid for
I mean-
by citizens and by tourism dollars.
yeah.
'Cause
The
whole
flooding that
fund of
I
the city-
experience in my yard is just my own personal problem. And trust me, the city is not doing anything to help it,
the residents.
other than the ditches. The ditches are
residents that I
helping.
speak to all seem to have the opinion or the thought process that every nickel that's being paid towards beach renourishment is coming out of their taxes they're paying, and it's not. And I think that you're right about the flooding. The flooding's a big problem, and it impacts everybody that drives through it, just like the beach is a big problem. When you have erosion, people can't go down the access to go to the beach. And that's up and down the whole island, it's not just Wild Dunes. So I think, once again, we've got to figure out, is it one island or not? And I think the point I was making was there's a big distinction in a contribution of residents giving money to do something, and the city residents aren't giving any money towards the beach right now to do the repairs. And I'm not saying they should or shouldn't be, I just think there needs to be some equality and fairness in how it's all handled.
Can I piggyback on that? So, I mean, we're debating here, do we do a long-term fix or do we do a short-term fix? And we could drain this fund and do all these Band-Aids as you talk about, but then we'll have no money. And what happens when that exhausts? So when you exhaust that money, then there's no more Band-Aids and you don't have the funding for a long-term fix. So trying to set all these policies and to define what's the fix. Because if we're going to use and talking about the Dare County model, they do a massive renourishment, and then after that, that municipality is on its own. There is no emergency funding, and that's why you can see it on the news, just happened again in Rodanth. Another house went into the ocean, and 2 have gone in the ocean. And guess what? They did nourishment there. So we got to, Band-Aids over 6 years is not going to be more cost-effective than a big nourishment. There's just, I'm not going to bite off on that. We can go through it. I'm sure our coastal scientists can guide us through that process, but everything we've learned so far says the opposite.
And I think, the other point to make is, having this aspirational and a plan to do renourishment, whether it's, on the north end, which is where the only area we've needed to do new renourishment projects, it happens to be that we've done one every 10 years for the last 20 years. Now we're talking about maybe reducing that frequency to about 8 years, and we've run the models, and we see that we have about $100 million shortfall. There's certainly a conversation worth having. What is the right frequency? But I think regardless of that, there is no guarantee that we're not going to face isolated emergency situations. Back to Dare County, you have communities there that have had $15, $17 million renourishment projects in the last 2 years and have homes being washed on the ocean. So there's no, I think it would be great that we have a cadence and we do projects every 8 years, but I don't think that we get away from facing potential erosional hotspots within that time frame. And I think that our goal is to establish a policy, okay, is the city going to be focusing on large renourishment projects, and we're going to be getting permits and always have a permit on hand to quickly act in the event that we need to accelerate a project. And then owners, on emergency situations, you're on your own, because we do not have the monies to do both. I mean, I think that is the question. Do we have the available resources today or in the future to be able to manage both needs?
Which brings us back to, how do we generate the money to make up the
Correct.
difference of it?
Because we have to generate the money. Even if the city, I think, says we're not in the emergency situation and we can't afford
still have
sandbags,
issues.
we still have a huge shortfall in order to effectuate this 8-year frequency for
But
projects.
it's even more complicated, because you have the city, let's say there's $8 million right now. Historically, they contribute 25% of that towards the beach renourishment. That's the number, I believe, correct?
The city,
On that end.
the city,
one end.
on the north end, on average, it's been about 18% that the city has contributed towards those projects.
What about on the south
We
end?
haven't had to do it.
We haven't
trying
had
to
to
do it,
do a
right.
project.
Right.
And we have funded 100%, whether it's through the Beach Preservation Fee Fund, which is generated by people staying on the island. The city has paid for 100% of that, whereas in the past, the city has not funded any emergency work.
Well, haven't we been going down kind of a path, and I think, Steve, your report kind of spelled it out for us, where we're looking at an initial kind of a get well to the healthy beach profile, and then we're looking at that 8 to 10 year interval, and that, yes, I think Dare County, and there may be homes going in, but I think they have concluded, and I think you've confirmed that the proactive plan, instead of 2, it could have been a lot more. That the damage is hopefully minimized once you're in that proactive plan, and it's less costly because it is proactive. But we've got to kind of land on some kind of a path here, I think, and it seems like we're on that. Yeah. And we're going to have Band-Aids along the way.
Agreed. I would just throw out there now that it seems that we need to be, I think we need to, at this point, set some sort of internal deadline to have a plan to fund a beach renourishment. and to have that, we've had a lot of wonderful conversations and a lot of information, but I think now we're at the point where we need to say in X months, 2 months, 3 months, we are going to have a plan for funding it. And for this, at least for this first beach renourishment, because not only do we need to have a plan to fund it, we then need to, if we're getting a bond, it sounds like we need to have a budget change. I don't know when city does their budget, of those sorts of things, so we can apply for the bond. There's the time period to get the bond, and then we talked about the time period to get mobilized to actually have the beach renourishment. So obviously, we want a long-term plan for 30 years, which may include the Army Corps and others, but I think we need a deadline that says by this date, we have a formal proposal that we're going to make to the city of the hows, whens, and whos. And then I think in the meantime, that we need an emergency protocol, as we're looking at now, that we need to be discussing to deal with the Band-Aids along the way until that's done. But I think the two need to be running simultaneous. And I also think whatever policy we put together now will probably need to be revised once we have a renourishment, because it's a different situation. Things are going to change as we move forward, and the way that the money is brought in and how we can fund this. We're just at a point now where I think if we don't set up this beach renourishment, we are going to be chasing down rabbit holes until there's nothing left to actually get the renourishment. And I think it is hard to put the onerous. Well, the onerous is going to be moving around, and I think that people will start to see even more damage, because we can't handle all the problems that are going to show up the longer this goes on. Obviously, it'd be wonderful if a nice little thunderstorm came and brought sand to our beach, which I think we were all hoping maybe there'd be some shifting, but so far it doesn't look that way. We're overdue for beach renourishment, so that would be my proposal, that we go ahead and we start looking at that time frame simultaneous with putting together what we do until that funding and that mobilization occurs. But I think that mobilization is going to need to occur sooner than later, or we're going to be out of Band-Aid money and renourishment money. That's just my
So
thought.
I would
kind
say
of
so-
separate this group's work.
Well, simultaneous, I think we need to be
It's
looking
two
at
two
both.
simultaneous tracks.
I mean, at this point, we've got a lot of information in order to ask
it.
for the funding. We have an idea of what the funding needs to be, and I think that we need to be moving forward with a deadline to get to the city a proposal of, we need the beach renourishment, it's going to cost X, we would like to start it in 2027, or that's the most realistic date. We are going to need to ask for funds, and we're going to need to look for other funds, but I think we can't, I don't think it's going to be hard to get all those funds in place quick enough to get this done before we run out of money.
But are you saying kind of hold the conversation on the other items? I mean, hold that independent of the deadline? So in other words, what our emergency protocol?
I think we can
No,
do
they need to
both,
be
yeah.
simultaneous. I think
have
we
it
need
all
to.
You're just saying.
We
create
can
a
handle
deadline for
both.
this
I think
group
we can
to
handle
have-
both, as far as we need to have this, because clearly, even if tomorrow city council approved a plan for a loan, you would still need to mobilize to have this happen. I mean, if
I think we
money
land-
rained
yeah.
down, right, but
I think
this
we
is gonna
landed
have to
last-
occur in
at
the
Yeah,
meantime.
and I think we landed at the last meeting. I mean, we're trying to solve a math equation right now. We've got a $3 or $4 million annual shortfall. We had a list of, and I think we talked about this, Desiree, one of the to-dos after the last meeting was, we had a list of a dozen different opportunities of where funding sources might come. We had the attorney come and speak to us, but let's put dollar opportunities next to each one of those. It should be relatively simple math, and then determine whether or not, what are we gonna bring to council to say, are we gonna pursue it or not? And fund that $3 to $4 million shortfall. Without that, we can't do any of this. And so I think, maybe at the next meeting, we go back to that list and spend half the meeting going through and saying, hey, let's validate that these are opportunities, and let's validate the quantification of them, and whether or not we want to pursue them. And then maybe the second half of the meeting is going through give us a chance to digest the sheet we just got. And,
And
go
these
through
are
the-
just questions.
Yeah.
These are just
No,
questions.
We've gotta
answer these
to
questions.
help-
You've got to answer these
Yeah,
questions.
these are great
helps the
questions.
As I said, if
conversation.
money rains down, these questions still need to be answered, and your time is valuable. And you should have some direction from city council based on what, or this group, city council, however it comes forward, on how to deal with these things.
Yeah.
They're
Our-
important issues.
So it's, our tax district's gonna be viable or not. Maybe we've got some decision on that from the attorneys. You know, or does it require legislation? And can we attach a percentage to business licenses? It may not be popular, but let's find out how much money that would raise and decide whether we want to do that. And just kind of go through and see where are we going to get that money?
And we are working
working
on
on that,
that
I know.
list. The last piece, there's not that many options that are available to the city at the local level. We're talking building permits, business licenses, and parking, and then taxes. I mean, that's really
Those are
it.
4 big buckets.
We are,
And a loan.
and then and a bond issue. I guess I'm thinking taxes and a bond issue could be together. We're working with PCI, who's our parking vendor, and they're running a few projections for council to consider next month. So that's the last piece that we're missing, and just waiting on that to wrap it all together. I think that there are challenges. There's been some information provided by the attorney on this idea of mimicking the Dare County model, where municipalities have a special tax purpose district at the local level. It seems like in state of South Carolina, those provisions are not available, and there might be a requirement for state law amendments, which, as we know, it's a 2-3 year process. So one lever that we were hoping to have seems to not be as easy as maybe we thought. So in lieu of taxes is certainly an option, and GO bonds and issuing debt for that. But we are, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, we're limited in what options we have, but those that we have, how can we maximize them? In terms of timing, recall, we're pursuing permits for a shoal management permit at the north end. We are hoping that that permit will be in place this fall and allow us to do a project in the winter. And on the south end, so that's even though, I mean, I don't see that as a Band-Aid. I mean, that is going to be a substantial addition of new sand to the north area.
I mean, it's a small renourishment project,
It's
essentially.
roughly,
Yeah.
would see it that way. And then we have the Army Corps Beneficial Use Project, which obviously should have started last year, and we shouldn't be talking about it. But we know they're here, they're working on it, they have a deadline of January, and we would be receiving, about 500,000 cubic yards of sand to that area. So we feel like these two projects that we've they're so close for us to grasp will minimize, I guess, I don't want to say minimize the urgency, but it'll give us some breathing room to then get in place for, get a funding place for a project on both ends in FY27, which is the realistic time, with permits and funding and all that, to get something in place to be ready for an execution of a project that year. But I don't want for people to lose sight of these two pretty significant projects that are just very close to us, to our grasp.
And Desiree, you're back on the tax district comment. You'll have heard back from the attorney, and it just doesn't look like it's absent a legislative change. It's not a possibility.
Yeah, we're doing more research
Okay.
on that just to confirm, but the initial analysis shows that municipalities utilize this municipal investment or Municipal Infrastructure Act that allows municipalities to create a proportional tax within different areas depending on the project. But beach nourishment is not a defined eligible use for that type of structure. So one of the suggestions is we can advocate for beach nourishment to be included in that state statute. And then special tax purpose districts are usually allowed in the state statute for police, fire protection, emergency medical services, recreation, and water and sewer. So as we start digging into what that may look like for us, it's just, it seems to be limited.
Gotcha.
In lieu of taxes, yeah.
Could we enlist the help of a lobbyist? Does the city have a lobbyist that's under?
We have the city has been working with a group of lobbyists at the state level, and we've been very successful. We've been working with them, I think, for 2 or 3 years. We are exploring options for the city to consider hiring a federal lobbyist. We had a meeting yesterday with one group, and we're continuing to look and see whether that's something that council wants to.
Could the lobbyists help us change some of the wording in the legislature so we could get the
Sure.
funding and the sources?
Certainly,
Three-
we had
three
our
or 4 years from now.
lobbyists, we
Yeah.
had
Just
the
takes time.
lobbyists
Yeah,
out
I know
here.
Takes a minute.
Yeah, and Tim, just think about that from, when the extra 1% A-tax was added in 2014. Going back and looking at the minutes and all the process, I mean, that looked like a 3-ish year process to get it through legislature, get it
Get all the
on a referendum, get it, to at the local level. And that's probably being kind, a 3-year process, so absolutely. And we had our lobbyist here earlier this month, I guess it was, and their number one takeaway with a bullet is get us beach renourishment funding at a state level, and if you don't, then give us some flexibility to put some of these tools in place that would let us do a tax district or a real estate transfer fee or a something. If you're not gonna do it, then let us have something.
And can we piggyback on the resiliency plan? I know that resiliency plan, renourishment is included in that, but are there?
At the
different-
state level, is that what
Yeah,
you're asking? Yeah.
State or federal, get more funding that way as well. I don't know, I'm just looking at it, but it would seem to be an avenue to go down, if you haven't already gone down there. I mean, you guys work really hard in getting everything
And
accomplished.
not at all being familiar with the economics of the city and the various rules that need to be applied. I mean, are we able to apply for a bond and the idea would be that we will be repaying back the bond sooner if possible because we have a lobbyist who's successful, or I get concerned. I don't want us to stop or slow down. I think we need a plan that goes down all the channels, but that we aren't waiting 2 and 3 years to try to say, okay. I think we need to be ready to employ the simplest ones to make sure the job gets done in the next X number of years that it would take to deploy and get ready. But in the meantime, trying to reduce the amount of debt that we carry by finding these other that are going to take a period of time to actually execute, and not all of them will be executed because we will be successful on some and not successful in others.
So the city can issue a GO bond that would be discussed as part of the budget process. Council starts that roughly in January.
Okay.
And a budget has to be ratified by the end of June. So and the budget would include some assumptions about debt. And,
Okay.
and it would budget the interest and debt service payments, depending on the term that it's selected. So it would be decided upon through a budget process. But before that, we have to we would have to decide how big of a project, are we doing 2 projects, when, how much money do we have, how much money do we have to borrow, if we have to borrow, and how is the city going to satisfy that debt service? So those are, I think, questions that would need to happen before, a bond issue is executed. I think that would be the easy part. You get a bond attorney and they write up everything and council approves it and we go to bat. But I think getting to what if and what you would be borrowing for is going to be the question.
Okay. And I think,
If I understand your question, if, say we wanted $10 million to go towards beach renourishment, I think you might have been asking, can we borrow $10 million and then only take 4 out of it if we need 4?
or
Which I
pay
think-
more back, pay it back quicker
And I
in
think
order
that
to
is
reduce
problematic.
That is problematic.
you-
I don't
Yeah.
think you can do that.
No, you would need to know exactly how much you need and how much you're going to spend for that particular
and
need.
what the resources are to
overborrow.
pay it
Correct,
back,
yeah,
right?
what you're borrowing, yeah.
The other 2 things I just don't want to lose sight of on our list, we had spoken about maybe approaching the $1 million promotional CVB kind of budget. That's, that's money that comes in and swivels out of our municipality. It's generated here. And then, I don't know that this would go anywhere, but we do have the ability, I think, within the state guidelines to increase our 1% to a beach renourishment to 2%. Is that correct? We'd have to make a change locally, but I thought the legislation allowed beach municipalities to contribute up to 2% of their A-tax into the beach renourishment fund. Is that?
Well,
We'd have to make a change locally.
state accommodation taxes, municipal accommodation tax, and hospitality tax revenue can be allocated towards beach nourishment. It is an eligible expense. It would be up to the city to decide, do we want to allocate all of our muni A tax, X 50% of our state aid tax, which is currently covering a lot of the city's operational costs with police, fire, public
Something would have to
works.
come off the list. yeah.
Correct, but so that is a budgetary decision of
prioritization.
council to say, we want to dedicate X to beach nourishment. It's an eligible
And it
expense.
could be a fraction of the 1% too. It
Yes,
doesn't have to be all or none. We can do
Correct.
whatever. So, I
Correct.
mean,
We
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 just want
can't
to,
get an additional 1%.
No,
We're already
understood.
collecting, but we can allocate the
yeah.
2% we're already getting all.
and that would be a
beach
prioritization conversation for the, yeah. And that can always, is that something that we can change and then change back if we want to, if we had the money? I mean, it's pull
Correct.
the lever for a while and
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's a council
reload,
conversation to, or decision to make different revenue bucket.
Man, I think we've kind of hit on this question number one here a little bit about, is the city legally obligated by virtue of having this money, collecting fees for beach preservation or some other mechanism, perform emergency work? We're kind of, it's what this discussion's about. But we're having to pick if we're gonna go with beach preservation, or is it blended, or is it the other? So,
Yeah, I would.
again, that's the tough part of the question. I mean,
So-
what you're talking about, Dan, do we take it? Because it wasn't allocated. Whenever the money was put aside, they never defined how it should be used. Is that correct?
Correct.
It was just said, hey,
there are certain things you,
Yeah, the
by statute, you
Yeah, the
can only use it
original-
for certain
Let me
things.
just, real quick, it'll take 2 seconds to
Yeah.
read the original ordinance that got passed, and it was via referendum and the whole thing. So revenue generated by the beach preservation fee shall be used exclusively for the following purposes: nourishment, renourishment, maintenance, erosion mitigation, and monitoring of the beaches within the corporate limits of the city of Isle of Palms, dune restoration and maintenance, including planting of grass, sea oats, other vegetation useful in preserving the dune system, and maintenance of public beach accesses. To me, it was 3 very specific
specific, but it
pieces.
doesn't
I think
allocate
what
how.
you're saying is which one. It doesn't
Which
say
one-
which one's
what's
the
your priority?
the priority.
We never
Okay.
defined a priority.
Yeah, well, but it doesn't address emergency controls at all, and I don't think that was ever anticipated, talking to prior council and mayors,
So,
that it was specifically around these pieces.
Erosion
I would
mitigation.
suggest that the language does include emergency, the way it's read, and,
So
I
the,
think it's gotta be reasonable, and I think you have to follow it based on all circumstances. You have to pay attention, one of the hard things is one of the discussions at one of the first meetings was, you've got a small area that's being impacted by it. Do we wanna wait until it's a larger area being impacted by it? The problem is, for those homes in the small area that are being impacted by it, it's everything to them. So how do you decide, we're gonna overlook you and the houses on the north and south that may fall in the water, because we're waiting for a bigger production? And that's where it's complicated, because you're right, it doesn't define it specifically, but it creates a duty, and the money's created for that duty, and then we have to figure out how it's handled. But as far as legal liability, I think you've got legal liability, and I think there's arguments to be made. Where they end up in front of a court knows. But
So-
the best thing is figure out a way to, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we all want the same thing. We want a strong, healthy beach. We want beach accesses that people can use. We want the citizens and residents to be protected, and that's what we have when we have the renourishment done. So how do we best effectuate that?
So the context of this number one question is when we initially had problems, the case was made to the city, you have that fund, there are emergency needs, and you have, it's in your beach management plan, an aspirational statement of maintaining a dry sandy beach. The case was made that you don't have a choice in the matter. You have to spend that money on this project now. The staff doesn't believe that's the case, but I know that that's kind of out in the ether as an obligation. And I think if we needed to drill down on that issue with this group, we certainly could, but that's kind of that's a fork in the road. If it's a legal obligation and the group thinks that you have to do it, then it kind of, the rest becomes easy. If you think that you have, or if you think the staff believes that city council is ultimately in control of controlling that, but if it's just a legal obligation, it's clearly a different path that you'd be considering. So that's kind of at the top of the list for a reason. The other questions really become moot if there is a requirement that every penny in that fund go as soon as the emergency need arises. You can really avoid the rest of the sheet, because that clearly dictates how that money's gonna get spent. So that's kind of the reason it's there at the top. The rest of the questions flow from it. And if there's kind of disagreement and there's feeling that there is an absolute obligation, you have to spend it, and you have to spend it all on emergency work came up first, so you have to spend it on that first, then that's kind of a stopping point. It's easy from there on out.
I mean, the way that reads, I mean, I say we don't have guardrails on the volume of funds that could be spent. And that's problematic. Like, because
And
then
that's
you,
question number 2.
And I think,
Yeah.
yeah,
Do you have to then get into,
is it a percentage or is it a combination?
And
I think
that's-
back to Dan's point, you know, is there a threshold where the city says, we're gonna step in and be responsible for this issue because it impacts 3 blocks, you know, it impacts X number of,
Yeah.
if it's more restricted, or you're talking about a handful of properties, does the city have the same responsibility to come in and mobilize contractors and do that? That's, I mean, we were trying to
yeah,
share all that.
Yeah, I'd take it, maybe suggest taking it one step up, because the emergency work is the requirement of the emergency work, in my opinion, in some cases, it's the result of, you know, I started on the planning commission and went through the comprehensive plan, and if you go to the section about the beach, and our requirements there, it is consistent, I think, with the state's posture of the protect, preserve instead of the retreat. So we took that upon ourselves at the city level to adopt the same posture. The question I think that we've been wrestling with is, what does that mean? So if we were to preserve the dune system, and if we were to be protecting the beach, and we had the resources to have done that over the last, 2 years, would we find ourselves in this emergency situation? Or would we have, again, assumption of resources aren't an issue, would we have, when we saw the dune system depleting at the velocity that it was, and we lost, I think, 1.1 million cubic yards in the prior 2 years before that, according to the charts, would we have initiated a beach restoration? So, I'm kind of the mindset, if we're not going to fulfill what we say, we call it aspirational. I call it, when we put it in writing and approve it, it's sort of a commitment to the community. If we're not going to do it, then we ought to change our policy. If we are going to do it, we got to figure out how we're going to do it.
Well, I think right now we're behind the 8 ball, so we keep trying to put a Band-Aid on it, when we really need to bite the bullet, so to speak, and do a big renourishment. Get the beach back to a healthy, stable beach, and then we can use the funds that we get from the accommodations tax to use as that Band-Aid until we get another renourishment. And I think we need to be on a schedule, whether it be the 8 years or 6 years, what it is, but to have that goal, have some kind of actionable plan that is actually put in place. But that's down the road. Right now, I think we really need to put, whether we have to borrow the money or whatever, and get a beach back to a healthy state. And then we can start applying the money that we get and save up for the next time around.
Well, again, back to my point earlier, the city is pursuing a shoal management permit, which the city did back in 2012 in between the 2 large projects.
Right.
We have been working with the Army Corps of Engineers for the past year or 2 on this beneficial use project that was coming up, had no control. So that felt to us like a very a reasonable plan. It was going to be free sand for the city, dump a lot of, bring a lot of sand that's beach compatible. And that's why we're thinking about 27. Should we be prepared with funding, permits, and everything in 27, which is 3 years from now, to be able to do a large nourishment projects, offshore nourishment projects for those ends, should these mid-size nourishment projects don't last us 3 years. The last time we did a shoal management project in 2012, it lasted for 4 years, roughly.
We did another one in early 2015.
2015. So these smaller scale projects are a sustainable and an economical way of adding additional sand, just like we are seeing the beneficial use project with the Corps. I don't think that we would have been doing a $20 million project at Breach Inlet knowing that we have this free sand coming that could reduce a little bit of the pressure on that area.
And I guess that brings us back to the earlier discussion, which is, you gotta make a decision. and is it a nourishment or is it a Band-Aid? But meanwhile, I'm encouraged by the conversation about other funding that's available. And I think once we delve into that a little more and we look at, what monies would be generated from the parking or from the taxes and all the other things that we've discussed, maybe we'll find that the gap isn't as big and it's easier to resolve.
Don't get too encouraged, Dan.
Well, but I think we need to get there first. I mean, I think we're jumping ahead without knowing that number, because even if, I think we talked about if everybody on the island, every household had to contribute money, it was a couple $100.
But that's what's not available.
But it's
We
not,
can't
I
make 'em do
understand
it.
that, but the point of it is, the more we can lower it, the number, the more we have other alternatives to look at. And even if you looked at increasing the 1% tax, not the 2%, but maybe we find that by going to 1.1%, it would make a difference. But in order to do that, we have to first know the numbers. So I think that's kind of where we are right now. We have to understand more to get to the next step.
So if I've heard correctly, we have until January is when city council we can start really digging in with bonds and budgetary considerations for the
January
next
through
year.
May.
Okay, so I would propose that we go ahead and we start putting together a timeline to get that information in front of the correct, not correct, that is the wrong verb, but to get in front of city council a proposal that they can work with and they can start considering soon enough that we can make these deadlines. I think that we definitely need deadlines now to get decisions made regarding moving forward to fund the project. We need to know what questions still need to be answered to fund the project. We need to know which of these areas we've discussed are no longer available. And I think we need to keep a running tab of that, because I think that city council deserves to know what we looked at and we looked at 10 items and 6 aren't available at this time. 3 might be available in the future, and we're pursuing those via these avenues, so it's very clear. I think that we need to also look at, besides the funding, which we need to really be on a deadline now as far as getting it done and moving forward. We need to take a plan that we've looked at a beach renourishment plan. We need to really make sure that that is what we want to propose and move forward with and sign off on that. And I believe that needs to go to city council as a plan that we're adopting, because they need to know what we're asking for funding for. And we need to put that into our timeline of when we get that to them to look at. And I think that once we actually have adopted a plan and we have started to look at funding, I think that some of these other things will start to fill in the blanks as far as emergency will become more clear. And I say that in terms of, well, if you have a beach renourishment plan in place and you're planning to do it, then I think that you can then see areas where homeowners may have responsibility or otherwise that right now maybe the city is absorbing. Where right now the problem is that without we're all flying solo, and as we've learned, and I know is still discussed as to various, whether it's sandbags, erosion control, hard erosion control, soft erosion control, whatever the control is right now, without a plan at all, it's hard to really make those decisions when, where, and how. And I think that there may be a place for homeowners to have responsibility once the plan is put in place. It doesn't mean enacted, but that we're actually moving forward in the right direction. So I think some of these questions are great questions that are really important to address. Then there's the unfortunate situation we're going to have, which is in the middle between the time we have a plan and we have a funding source that we're moving forward with. We still have a vulnerable population, and that's where we're going to need to have some rules of the road. And completely get it, but I do feel like we've had incredibly good conversations, but now's the time to put the timeline together and execute each of these issues and moving forward. And with that, I think that the first question of legal liability changes as we address each one of these issues as well. That's just my thought, but I think it is time to act.
I'll just throw a couple of comments on that, and maybe more is just something to kind of be thinking about as you're pondering these before the next meeting, but obviously not speaking as an attorney. But as far as legal obligation for any community to protect individual houses, I've not seen that anywhere else in South or North Carolina where we've been working, over the past 20 years. I know there's been a couple of places where that question has come up, like Hunting Island. There used to be cabins at the south end of Hunting Island, and those owners sued the state saying, y'all were responsible for maintaining a beach in front of our properties, and that wasn't successful. I think nearby Harbor Island had a similar type suit against some houses that were out in the ocean, and that HOA actually has covenants that don't allow for projects to occur on the beach, and so I don't think those owners won that as well. I'm sure there's legal questions and discrepancies and things, but I do get, if you look at that, if that policy were true up and down the state, there are places where the erosion rate is so high, it's unsustainable for a community to be able to protect, certain properties. You would bankrupt a community on that. So I'm not, I would say that I don't think the city would be legally obligated, but again, that's a question for attorneys to do or to figure out. So just something to kind of think about.
I would only suggest that, my guess is those communities don't have a statutory written agreement as to what they're required to do, and that's probably the difference here.
I mean, some of them would have local comprehensive beach management plans established. There are others that if you don't have a local comprehensive beach management plan, you default to the state's plan. So some type of plan exists for those communities that may not spell out exactly what they're going to do. I also would wonder how would that set precedent for any other type of potential damage. So if you have a drainage plan that the goal of that plan is to try to improve drainage, but if you have water up under your house, does that open the city up to be responsible for all those other type things as well? And I'm speaking way out of turn now.
What
People
is,
still-
no, you referenced a
Well,
statutory
we
agreement.
passed a tax
The
with specific
ordinance that
provisions.
Philip
So
read.
not the beach management plan, but the fact
The
that you
ordinance.
enacted a tax.
You
That
have a
ordinance
tax with
in
certain
combination.
requirements that you're supposed to do, and that becomes essentially a contract.
But I think these
People are
properties,
contributing to it under the auspice of this is what the requirements are, and that's what, listen, I was, when I looked at it at first, my thought was this is really not probably a proper conversation for all of us to have, because it's gonna be a legal question, and you're gonna find, multiple different variations as far as what people think the right answer is. I think a better way for us to do it is try to work through as an island, under the auspice of one island, and try to resolve these issues.
That's all I'm trying to say is that we prioritize, like, how do we use this? I don't want to go willy-nilly one direction and just dump it all one way and then go, all right, we're out. And then those same homes, the same homeowners, and I know you guys are engaged in this, you're gonna be like, well, what do we do now? Like, what's the next step? And then the city would say, well, we've exhausted what we have. I mean, what's the answer then? I mean, is the city obligated to give $0? I mean, we just
But
go hat in hand.
Nobody's brought that yet, but I guess an argument could be made that you're obligated to do everything at all times. Nobody's brought that. I mean, everybody's trying to, I think all the residents are trying to, or everybody involved, the committee is trying to find a way to resolve this for the best of everybody.
I guess, and from my work experience in my past, from a military side, you're not going to win all your battles. But we're trying to win a war, right? So you have to pick and choose. Somebody's going to lose. Like that's a hard thing to say. I know it doesn't sound good.
So lawyers live in the world of gray.
I understand.
So we understand that. There's black and white and there's gray.
But
We're always trying to resolve things in gray, because if you go to black and white, someone's gonna win and someone's gonna lose. And the same as with the city.
Yeah,
If there
I
was
just-
litigation, but the idea is to try to find a way to resolve it.
yeah, absolutely. We want to find the best solution for everyone.
I would say to keep it in perspective,
Thank you, Deborah.
well, and whether good or bad, the city's budget, annual budget is $26 million. And that's to run every department, projects, I mean, the entire city budget. We are looking at an FY '27 to do 2 projects on the north and the south end to be $22 million. So I think that is, it is a lot of money. We are very limited in what the city can, it just in taxes alone, can raise. And I think to your point, coming up with all of the different levers and understanding where the share may be, is there an added share for certain property owners that are directly benefiting? Not because we should or shouldn't, it's because we cannot afford it other way. But so we're talking in magnitude of, you know, the equivalent of the city's annual budget for one project that we don't know how long it'll last.
Can I give you, I'll give you an alternative view on that. So I agree with what you're saying, but if we look at it in today's dollars, the 20 million, and if it's every 10 years, we're really looking at trying to increment a revenue find, whether it's on the island or off the island, or from the revenues that are generated on the island or from the state or what have you. It's 15% higher than where we are today. So, you know, that to me is not an insurmountable number. Now, that's on an annualized basis. You know, and one last point, I think, you know, a big reason we're in this spot, and, you know, it's a public beach, but the state has pretty much said no funding. And that has really put us, you know, it's put our backs up against the wall here to try to, you know, serve the whole public beach aspect and protect the assets here. And without the beach, you know, what do we got?
I think a lot of energy needs to be focused on that because the state establishes regulations, dictates what we can and cannot do, takes forever to get permits approved, and provides no funding. I mean, talk about an unfunded mandate,
Yeah.
if you will.
And that gets back to my comment. They have, if that's the stance that the state is going to take, then they ought to change their stance, because right now they're in a preserve and protect and not a retreat. And I don't get it. I don't get how that stance can be taken without funding the stance.
Because that's how you get votes.
Precisely.
I mean,
That's my soapbox for today.
So we're over an hour
So
in.
where are we?
on
Yep.
Question one.
All right.
That will never be decided until it goes to court.
I'm with Cindy's point.
Yeah.
I mean, it almost sounds as though the emergency, you know, I think we all kind of collectively agreed that we would go through emergency protocols and policies, formulate a recommendation. Is it that it's too sticky to, and it will gum up this committee's work so that you can't get back to the funding? I mean, I'm almost think I'm hearing, let's save that because it's very gummy.
And
Focus on
get past these two
finances, get back to
projects.
financial levers with a goal of, you know, being quiet on this for the time, focus on the money, and then revisiting this.
I think
As
there's
the time
a
needs.
desire of doing both concurrently, but maybe focusing our next few weeks' efforts in going back to the planning model, establishing what the cost would be for the net, you know, if we go to this, if there's buy-in to this 8-year frequency and cadence for projects, let's identify what the first project would be, when it could realistically be executed, how much is it gonna cost, do we have the money to execute that project? And, you know, I think based on the models that we've seen, again, based on a lot of assumptions that I guess we, you know, this committee and council would have to agree on, we'll be in okay shape to effectuate that first project. Things get real tight when we get to the second, you know, the next project number 2, which would be 8 years following that, and so on and so forth. That's when we start seeing, you know, a very big negative numbers in our schedule. But I'm guessing that is what we want to do. We want to get a plan in place for our first iteration of this 30-year plan. Every 8 years, when can we get a project? Do we have the money? And if we don't, what are our options to get the money, whether it's via a GO bond or whether it's raising revenue between now and 2027 to be able to pay for this project cash. I think a huge assumption there, back to, I think Scott made this point earlier, we are operating on an assumption with the Wild Dunes piece, the north end piece, of the city just contributing 25%. I think our models obviously are malleable, so we can change that, and if the assumption is 50%, based on the fact that the city generates about 50% of ATAX, Beach Preservation Fee Fund, from behind the gates, then that changes certainly changes how much money we would have to secure between now and when we have a project in '27. So I think that that is a big question, and I'm interested to know what this committee believes. Should we continue our planning model with the assumption that the city's only gonna contribute 25%? Or do we assume that we're gonna cover 50% of that project on the north end?
Was
So
one
I
of the
think-
conversations
go ahead.
last week to, and maybe 2 weeks ago, was to reach out to Wild Ends and see if we can solidify what they're going to do so that it's not floating in the air and subject to change?
So they are on board with the city covering 25% of the shoal management project that's coming up this winter. They were going to go back and run through their models based on the real estate transfer fee to see what they can support on their end without any additional assessments. So we're waiting on that piece to determine whether 25 is doable, 25% for the large-scale project, or we need to make those adjustments there, and what adjustments they might be able to have to
Do
do.
you know how long the timetable will be before we find out the answer?
We're meeting with Dave in 2 weeks, in a week or two, I
Okay,
believe.
great, okay. So maybe before the next meeting?
Hopefully, I mean, depends on when we schedule our next meeting.
Yeah, and I think that those will be pieces that we're gonna write out, the unknowns. So, and those are the pieces we're gonna need to know. We need to somehow have this all written out, and it's like, okay, well, we need a lobbyist to look at this, we need a lawyer to look at this, we need to have a meeting to look at this. And then, but we need all this done by October 30th in order to then do this. And I think that
Project
Wild
plan.
Dunes is probably also gonna wanna see a plan. So I think that the plan, we need to, again, open that plan back up, make sure that we're good with it, and that this is the plan we plan to propose, or what plan is it we plan to propose we're trying to get funding for. And then, Douglas, just going back just a moment to the sticky stuff, I think the reason some of this is sticky is that right now we are so far behind the 8 ball at the moment via various circumstances that a lot of these things done as one-offs with homeowners is it just won't work. So in other words, me going and getting a dump truck full of sand and putting it in front of my property right now would be literally just sending it to the sea. Like, it needs to be more than one home. Or we've talked about various other things like sandbags. It was the same thing. If I put sandbags in front of one house, yes, that may, but it's not it's more sustainable, it's better. And we've asked those questions. So I think some of the stickiness that we're sitting in with this, and why I feel like if we have a plan, some of it's better addressed moving forward, is just that some of these things, though the city would like to get that, I'm sure would love to have another way to fund it, it is hard to do as one-offs by one owner. I'm not saying all of it, but some of it. So that's, I think, where some of the stickiness comes. But again, right now, I feel like we have various obligations we've talked about. I won't redo that, but I'm gonna feel more comfortable when we're starting to look at a spreadsheet or we've clicked this off. We have a plan. We have 7 sources of funding we're looking at. Here's the deadlines we need answers. Here's what they ultimately could provide. Here's when we're going, here's the town council meeting we're going to, where we're gonna propose X. This is the one we're gonna propose. Because they may not accept the plan, and they, then the funding changes. Sorry,
So let's
I'm
set our next
passionate. I am
meeting.
passionate.
You're
It's time to
describing-
move
yeah.
forward.
Let's set our
We've got
next,
so much
let's
good
set our next
information.
meeting.
I think you just described the PMO.
Desiree, what do y'all look like? I mean,
Do we,
By next
Couple of
Friday.
weeks.
Friday?
the 6th?
I mean, if we're just opening back up the plan and looking at the assumptions, I mean, there's not prep for that.
Can we move it back to 9?
Yeah,
It's
this
really
is just
hard
for
to make the minutes.
coffee.
I will
Said
be,
coffee
I will
with
not
you.
be here on the 6th,
Yeah.
but
Feel free.
feel free.
Well, is it really just about opening the assumption and model plan back up and looking at revisiting those and nailing
I
those
think
down.
that we need to do that, and because we haven't looked at it in a while, and I don't think that, I think we're gonna run into, people can't come each meeting, so as important as you are, I think if we can find something we can do next week that we can go back to you with questions on, would be great.
Stephen,
I think just from an administrative
Phone, whatever.
view, I think, Cindy, what you're describing is putting together kind of a project management plan.
Yes.
It's basic stuff,
Time
but
to
we've
do
got to,
that.
we got to get the pencil to paper, I think, and on the milestones and the deliverables and the timeline is, I think, what we're talking about here.
All right, so 6 at 9 o'clock. And Stephen, you're available either phone or here, since we're doing the model.
So we're talking about the financial model, or
Yeah.
we're talking about the 8-year cadence model?
It's all the same, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's.
I mean, you got
making
erosion
assumptions on
rates, you
erosion
got
rates.
Correct.
inflation rates, you got cycle times.
I guess the finance model is where we get into all the assumptions about city
Taxes and-
participation, grants, additional funding that needed.
Then I'm thinking erosion rates and
Yep.
that type.
For
What
next
Stephen's
week,
put
and then
together.
we need you absolutely at the,
For the finance piece, okay.
Douglas, you good next
So
week or not?
I guess I was thinking that we were settled on 8-year cadence, a certain
I
cost.
think I'm just hearing we want to before we
I think
put
we
pen to
need
paper, we just need to
decide,
revisit
is
it.
this it? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not saying we have to but we need to
Why don't we
decide,
put-
is
why don't
this
we
what we're
put-
giving to the city
Why don't
council?
we put pen to paper, why don't we, I mean, I think everybody's 8 years seem to be the tentative answer. It's not like we're signing this in blood.
So we
Yeah.
kind of had.
So we
I mean,
have
had a
that,
sheet
right? I
you
mean,
got
we've
it,
already
yeah.
done
All
that.
of these filling in the blanks, the kind of 3 remaining parts on that sheet were the funding sources, the emergency protocol stuff, and your positioning on an Army Corps project. All of that other stuff, we've kind of
Right.
checking off as we go. So I think from my perspective at least, those funding levers, what you're gonna do and what you're not gonna do, and this emergency work, and then, and I don't know even really what the Army Corps kind of recommendation would be, but I think I was thinking those were your last 3
And-
pieces to kind of put into a plan.
And I was gonna say, especially on the east end, this 8-year cycle is, I think, really needs to be a funding goal, but you want to set it up where you have enough flexibility, because the way the beach changes up at the east end is so dynamic and so unpredictable with the way these shoals attach. So having a plan where you may be at year 7 and say, you know what, we need to pull the trigger a little early, at least we're close to that funding. Or hopefully the beach lasts a little longer and you can delay the project.
Does it make sense to, just to add more complexity to it, to figure out the value of what it's gonna cost to do it in 6 years versus 7 years with the Band-Aids, estimated Band-Aid cost versus 8 years with the Band-Aid cost, to make sure that it still makes sense? I know it's estimates because things are ever changing, and I know the last couple of years on the East Coast have been remarkably changing.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
if we, because I know that the comfort level for the city, at the end of the day, I'm assuming is gonna be to make sure that it financially makes sense.
Yeah.
And so it might be,
So
consider those different
do you
numbers.
define Band-Aid, like this shoal management project and the beneficial use project? Do
Well, I
you
was
see
talking
those
more
as
about
Band-Aids or the emergency work, sand scraping, sandbags, trucking in?
I would suggest that the Band-Aids would be any expenditure from the city to keep things maintained until we do the renourishment. So the triggers that we had talked about, and I know we can discuss whether or not that's a responsibility or not a responsibility later on, but as
Sure.
far as figuring out the numbers, it seems to make sense to figure out at what point is there a break even? And at what point does it make sense to do the renourishment sooner or later?
yeah, it's a little difficult because if it's just a long straight beach and you have a very consistent erosion rate, you're basing a 6-year renourishment on the amount of sand you've lost over 6 years. You're basing the 8-year nourishment on a little bit more sand because you've lost more. So your savings is really a very simple calculation on your mobilization cost over time. You're not really changing your quantity of sand. When you actually go into to practice, you'll be looking at your beach condition. You're projecting that we're going to lose 150,000 yards every year for 8 years. And when you get to that 8-year period, if you've lost a little more, then you need to increase your quantity to account for that. So with all this, there does need to be some flexibility with, quantities and conditions and the way the shoal's positioned. Like right now, if you did a big project, you're still going to be gaining several 100,000 yards of sand over the next year because the shoal's still attaching.
But you're
as
also
a,
saving the money that you're not spending, you know, with sand.
well,
rates.
now,
So-
that's, yeah, true. So if you're able to avoid those emergency situations by doing a project every 6 years, then you would
That's
have
your
those.
savings.
Or
savings.
8 instead of 10, whatever the
Right.
numbers are.
Right. But, yeah, my goal is to have y'all as many tools and flexibility in your toolbox as possible.
Could you please email this out to us?
Sure.
So then for next Friday,
Are we talking about financial levers? Or are we going back to erosion rates and beach profiles and ideal cadence? I thought that was all so. I thought we were just down to financial levers.
I just want to see it, I just want it, that's all.
Just
I
a
don't mean, I
a
just want it
revisit.
in here,
Maybe a
I just want to
revision.
see it in front of
Yeah,
my,
just
in
what
front
we
of me,
have, I
that's
think we
all.
just
But I think
document
the
what we already have.
financials
Yeah.
can be more, but let's just make sure as we go through that there's,
Gotta have a document, living document.
we need a living document, and we need to be able to be working on setting a timeline with, and, well, again, just,
Is that a tidy, I mean, to me, I do feel like a January, and I don't know if that's too far out. I may have thought you were closer than that, but, I mean, do we want to kind of set January as the wrap-up?
at the latest.
at the
Okay.
latest, no, I
Deadline,
agree
yeah.
with you. I was just trying to come up with, we need something we're moving back from. If there's an earlier deadline that we have to meet in order to get to the point where we can
Bring something to
request
council.
a bond and, you know, and when these meetings are, so that we're on a meeting schedule, so that, and do we need to break it into segments, such as, do we want to plan that at the October meeting or September meeting, we're bringing the plan forward so they can see the plan, and then funding would be at a different meeting?
Why don't we discuss that at the next meeting?
So I think
We'll put
that's
some-
what,
we'll
right,
put the
it's all
deadlines
part
together.
of
Let's do
putting
that.
together a schedule to actually execute.
Yeah, so Douglas, I think our revisit of the assumptions will take
Yep.
nanoseconds, that's not
Mhm.
long. Then we
And
can,
focus on the levers.
and then put
And then we'll
together some
have this
timeframes.
as
We just keep it in front of us, yeah,
Keep us-
because we need to be well
kind of work
aware
through-
of,
working through the
Yeah.
list.
Sounds good.
Okay, guys.
All right,
Try not to miss it.
oh, yeah, all right. Douglas, you want to take us off record at 11:52-ish?
and of course, she'll be